Hello, everyone. In this presentation, I will be walking you through the definition of dyslexia as the one that's written by the International Dyslexia Association. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be breaking down this gigantic definition phrase by phrase so that we understand all of the parts of the definition. To begin with, let's just talk about the word dyslexia. We will do a little morphology lesson here, just like the way we would do it with our own students. So dys means trouble with, and lexia means words. So dyslexia means trouble with words. There are lots of common myths floating around out there about dyslexia, even though they are not backed up by science. For example, seeing things backwards, or that boys are more likely to have it than girls, or that it only occurs in average to above average children, that being a lefty predicts or goes with dyslexia, and that we can't diagnose dyslexia until after first grade was completed. So there's lots of myths attached to this word dyslexia. So try to let go of those. And as you're watching this presentation about the definition, and as you're reading Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz, try to rebuild your conceptualization of dyslexia. And yeah, get rid of all those old preconceptions. Now let's talk about how dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. So we know that dyslexia is neurobiological. That means we can trace it to a difference in the way the brain is wired or the way the brain functions. And that doesn't mean necessarily that it certainly doesn't mean that people with dyslexia are flawed, but because our culture is so connected to written language, these brains have sort of a disadvantage, these types of brains. A dyslexic brain has a disadvantage because it has trouble manipulating language. So we know it's brain-based. We know it isn't a flaw, it's just a difference. Because our language is because our culture and our world is so reliant on written language, it is a big deal to be dyslexia, and it has significant impacts on your life. So this is why we bother to study it and do this kind of brain imaging. We can see that through these fMRIs, it's a functional MRI, so it means that the person in the MRI machine is doing a task while they are in there, as opposed to they're not just sitting still. So they're doing they are sitting still, but they're doing a task. So that could be reading words on a screen in front of them, listening to pairs of words to determine if they rhyme or not. There's all different language tasks that researchers use depending on what they're studying. And what they have understood is that there's more brain activity in the front and on the right side of the brain for when somebody with dyslexia is doing language tasks. When a skilled reader without dyslexia is doing language tasks or reading tasks, the reading happens mostly in the back left part of the brain. So we see some differences, and people with dyslexia can learn to read, but they're often using this roundabout way to get those tasks done. So it takes longer and it feels way more laborious than it does for somebody with typical brain organization. So what can we do about this? Can we do anything? Well, the good thing is, yes, there are actually educational solutions that can target the way that a dyslexic brain works to try to reorganize it to be more efficient for reading and writing tasks. You'll see this diagram or something similar to it in the Shaywitz book. But do you see that little yellow circle there? That is the back left part of the brain. That's the word form area. That's the part where we see a lot of activity when somebody is involved in skilled reading. So somebody new to reading in kindergarten or first grade who's struggling, we would not see a lot of activity there. That's when children and adults are fluent readers, we see them using the word form area. It's as if they've memorized all these words and that they're sight words, but that's not what's happening. They really are analyzing every letter in the word that they see. It just happens so rapidly. And basically, they've done it so many times successfully. Kind of imagine that neural pathway is just beaten down. Like when you're doing a path over and over in a woods or a meadow, it's just beaten down. And so it happens rapidly. And the Shaywitz book will elaborate more on what the significance of these other areas. So an early reader, a young reader, their brain might have more activity in the front in the articulation word analysis area because they're working at that decoding zone. Likewise, a struggling reader, someone with dyslexia, would be there as well. So on the previous slide, we saw sort of a drawing of what happens. Now imagine we're looking down at the brain and we see the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And we can see how the top image is of someone without dyslexia, and we see a lot of activity in the back of the brain, that word form area. And in somebody with dyslexia, we see more activity in the front and then on the right side of the brain. So there's a lot more analysis going on, which is not as efficient. Actually, this link, I'm not sure if it will work for you if you click on my presentation. I don't think so because you're watching this through YouTube. So I'll have to add this link somewhere else for you to watch in the class. So as we wrap up the piece of the definition that talks about dyslexia being neurobiological, I just want to make some final points about that. Dyslexia is inherited, so often we see in other parts of the family tree, parents, aunts and uncles, cousins, we might see other people who struggle to some degree with reading and writing, and it might not present itself identically. Like the autism spectrum, imagine that dyslexia is a sort of a spectrum as well, and the difficulties might present in sort of different magnitudes. The common thread is that they're all based phonological in origin, but there might be different characteristics to each dyslexic in the family. And children are born with dyslexia, so this is not something that happens as a result of what you did or didn't do in preschool or who they had for first grade. The instruction they have makes a huge difference in how they can close the gap with their peers, but they're born with it. And so that being said, is there something we can do when children are really little to catch the dyslexia before it becomes this huge struggle? There's a lot of researchers in Boston that are looking into scanning children at a really young age or screening them at a really young age so that we can provide them with early intervention right from the get-go. I know one researcher is also interested in getting insurance involved to pay for this sort of thing, since yet because it's not a medical condition, that is proving to be a little tricky. Dyslexia cannot be cured. It's not a medical or physical illness that you can take a pill or do a treatment and get it out of your body. Yet you can rewire and sort of network and build more efficient pathways in the brain, so you can treat it. People with dyslexia can be taught to read and write, and there's obviously different degrees of how much dyslexia is affecting your reading and writing ability, and so that plays a role in how easy it is to remediate those difficulties. This is just a silly illustration, showing us how complicated the wiring is in the brain. Of course, it's not really wired like this, but it's a little bit easier to explain or imagine than those tricky neural pathways that are going on in there. The next piece of the definition has to do with dyslexia being difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So we hear a few different things there. This is where you can kind of see the different shades of dyslexia. And I think this is one of the reasons teachers might miss the opportunity to diagnose someone with dyslexia because it looks different. We could have a child reading, having oral reading fluency at benchmark, but still their spelling is horrific. Or so they're reading fast enough, but then we'll find out that their comprehension is the problem because it took them so much effort to actually keep their head above water and read at that rate. So there's all sorts of ways that it kind of manifests itself, but it's mostly, and we're going to see clues in their spelling and in their decoding. So this list shows the many ways that dyslexia might present. And so because teachers are sometimes looking for one thing or another to prove that a child has dyslexia, they might overlook it. If they're just looking for reversals or if they're just looking for poor fluency, then they might miss out on other difficulties that the student is having. So sometimes a student can read a passage because they are so savvy and they have great comprehension, great vocabulary, great syntax, so they can kind of guess what word comes next, but they can't read words in isolation. So that's a big clue right there. Or difficulty decoding nonsense or unfamiliar words. So they can keep their head above water in second grade and third grade, reading the passage, reading these known words. If you show them a nonsense word like div, they wouldn't be able to decode that accurately. And that matters because when a child is decoding a multi-syllable word, oftentimes in a multisyllabic word, each little piece of that is sort of like a nonsense word. If you were to break apart picnic, if a child doesn't have that word memorized and they have to just break it into 2 syllables and then read 1 syllable at a time, each of those little syllables is a nonsense word. So if they can't read nonsense words, then they don't really have advanced decoding skills. Some people overlook the importance of those nonsense word screeners that we find with Dibbles and other little quick tests. Those are important. They don't tell us everything about a student, but they give us a quick look at who does and does not have this skill, and then we can go further with that information. So the reading comprehension could be superior to their decoding. So they might be able to put the whole thing together because they've got the content knowledge, the background knowledge, they've been paying attention in class, they're hearing what everybody else is saying, they just have great world knowledge that will help them fill in the blanks, but they can't read and the individual words in the text, or if they stumble on one word, they lose that whole section. I think the type of dyslexic we look for is usually the one that just sounds terrible reading orally, right? I mean, that catches our attention as teachers. So when we hear that their reading is full of errors or takes so much effort and labor, that gets our attention. So that kind of child with that profile, we might figure out right away, unless we blame it on laziness or being distracted or not trying, and that can get in the way too. And sometimes we just see that attitude. What we don't see is why the student has that attitude, and it's because this is so hard and it makes them feel so badly about themselves. Then there's the little words. There are usually these high frequency small words, that, is, and, for, they, this. Those words that teachers usually teach as red words, trick words, sight words, whatever you call them. There are kids who trip up on those, and that is called rapid and automatic naming. So RAN, RAN. You might see that written in an article or book. And rapid automatic naming may or may not be part of a child's dyslexia. Some kids have really strong visual memory and they rely on memorizing things, and that gets them so far and they can't decode. Other kids don't. their visual memory is really weak and their recall is really weak. And so that's called the double deficit, when you have trouble decoding and have trouble with rapidly naming these itty-bitty common sight words. Of course, slow reading, poor spelling, that grabs our attention too, as long as teachers don't mistakenly blame other factors for that. Also, it should be said that ADHD and dyslexia, it's called comorbidity, which is a terrible term, right? Comorbid, that means they often happen at the same time. So often someone will be, have the clinical diagnosis of ADHD, which is true and valid, and dyslexia, true and valid, and they're colliding. And you can imagine how difficult it is for that child to make sense of this, because not only has their ADHD gotten in the way of them receiving that instruction, but they also have a disability, making it really hard for them to even manage and make sense of that instruction. So again, we're likely to blame that child for wiggling in their seat, not paying attention, not practicing at home with mom and dad, when really we're overlooking the root cause, which is neurological, it's phonological, and we need to pay attention to that and do something about it. So let's talk about the phonological piece. What does that mean that the deficit is rooted in the phonological component of language? This is an amazing graphic that is often referenced and cited in academic journals about the reading process. I love it because it's such a clear way of showing how complex language and reading are, but it also shows how it shows the complexity and how all these pieces are not working on their own, but they're all woven together. So over on the right where you see skilled reading, that's our end goal. We have children who get there in 3rd or 4th grade and they sound lovely. Occasionally a child gets there even earlier. That's what we want for our students. Now back it up, go all the way to the left hand of the slide, and those are all the different components of language and reading. Now, these have to be, most things on here have to be directly taught. This is our goal as teachers this is our job as teachers to directly teach these components. Some of these things you'll look at this list and you'll say, oh yes, that's a strength of mine, or our curriculum, or my team at school, we do a really good job with those pieces. And then you'll probably also see things on here that your curriculum, your school are a little bit weaker on. And we can imagine if we're not giving students what they need, or if they have a neurological deficit in one of those areas, that rope is weakened. So there's going to be issues with skilled reading. Now, when you're doing something like a Dibbles and you're listening to them read out loud for a minute, you're not going to be able to work backwards from the Dibbles. The Dibbles does not give us that much information. All the Dibbles do, and similar things, Ames, Web, or any curriculum-based measure, tells us when skilled reading is or is not happening. If it is happening, great, we can move on. If it is not happening, then we have to do some more digging and figure out why. So people don't like Dibbles because they say, oh, it just drills kids over and over and it doesn't even tell us anything. True, it's just a quick drill, quick little dipping your toe in the water just to quickly see who's got it, who doesn't. And then when you see who doesn't, then you got to go backwards and you have to look at them closer as a student, using either different probes, different measures, or sitting with them, watching them work, listening to them work, and try to figure out where is that difficulty coming from. With a lot of our students with dyslexia, we're going to see that difficulty rooted in the phonological component. So with my students, when I'm meeting in my private practice, when I'm meeting a child for the first time, usually the first thing I do with them is something to do with sounds. I'm having them clap syllables, or do a rhyming activity, or tapping out the sounds in a word, telling me maybe even just the first sound they hear in each word. Depending on their age and what I know about their profile from their teacher or their parent, I will do some sort of or many sound activities to see if there's strength or weakness there. I'm usually going to find a weakness there unless they've had some really good therapy before me, and then I can note that. And then of course I would look into their decoding as well. If they are weak phonologically, they're going to be weak with their decoding. That is almost always the case, because the decoding, sounding out words for reading and spelling, is dependent on that phonological strength, having that awareness and being able to manipulate and work with sounds. Now, a minute ago I said if their skilled reading is fine, great, move on. If their skilled reading is fine, yet their spelling and writing is atrocious, that could be a clue that they are really good at compensating. And this rope is strong only because, see all those things on the language comprehension end of things? Their background knowledge, their vocabulary, their knowledge of language structures and how sentences are built, all of that might be so strong that it's covering up the fact that they have poor phonological and decoding skills. So beware of that, because those dyslexic students are often missed. They're just scooting by, they sound good enough while they read, and we don't know why they can't spell or write, or they hate those things in school. And it's because if we dug deeper, we would find that phonological weakness. And that usually shows up in spelling because they don't know how to represent sounds the right way, or there's this orthographic weakness in knowing which letter combinations are used to represent those sounds. There's so much to talk about on this slide. You can see why this is one of those seminal graphics that's used so much in reading research. So on the previous slide, you heard me talk about phonological process, or the different tasks I would do with a child to see what their phonological skills are. Phonological awareness is this big umbrella for all different kinds of work with sounds. The most basic and the easiest phonological skills would be something like rhyming, where you're just where you're hearing the rhymes in words, counting syllables, counting words in a sentence. Those are very basic phonological tasks. Usually that's developed in pre-K, right? Alliteration, grab a group of grapes, that kind of wordplay, that would be pretty basic as well. And then the most complex kind of phonological awareness is called phonemic awareness. So you'll hear those terms a lot. Phonological is the big chunk, all the different kinds of work with sounds, including rhyming and syllables. And phonemic awareness zooms in on just the individual phonemes, individual sounds in a word. And that's the most complex level of phonological awareness. And so somebody with phonemic awareness would be able to sound out a word, map, app. They would be able to manipulate that. Okay, change the to a app, sap. So tasks like that. Also in that phonological area, though, is this idea of phonological, we can think of memory. So when a student is looking down at their book and they're sounding out the word and they sound it out correctly, but they snap it together the wrong way, like k, at, tack. That's not a visual issue. That's not a reversal issue. That's the fact that they can't hold all those sounds in their brain in the right order and then articulate them in the right way. So we would call that phonological memory. Likewise, we would see that with encoding and the way that they spell. They say the word to themselves, stop, but they don't get all those sounds, or they don't get them all in order. If your school is not doing some sort of phonological awareness or phonemic awareness screener with kindergarten and first grade children, then something is missing. Probably something is missing in the way that they understand how reading develops, because every elementary school should be paying attention and concerned with students' phonemic and phonological awareness. That's going to show you, that's the biggest connection to reading difficulties. So if we see that a child has difficulty with that, we don't know if it's dyslexia, but we know they're going to have trouble learning to read. It could just mean that they came from a disadvantaged background where they weren't read to very often, or maybe they didn't go to preschool and they weren't exposed to the amount of rhyming books and wordplay games that other children their age had. So maybe it's possible when you just zoom in and give them what they need right when they enter kindergarten, that special attention will pay off and they'll catch up to their peers. But you don't know. You don't know if this is the sign of dyslexia and a lifetime of possible struggle. So when we see kids in kindergarten and first grade struggling, having phonological difficulties, we should zoom in right away and pay close attention. Not necessarily put them on an ed plan right from the get-go, but we should be doing that targeted strategic work to intervene while the gap is really small, because that gap will just widen as we let those kids go on. So think about it. Does your school assess for phonological difficulties in kindergarten and first grade? Often that looks like the dibbles. If they're doing that, and if they know what to do with that information, then that's a good sign. Now let's talk about how dyslexia is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. This graphic is from the Shaywitz book, so you will see it again in your reading. This idea of the seat of strength model. There are many ways that people, including dyslexic people, show their strengths. And part of what we might expect to see when we're looking for dyslexia in a student is it unexpected in relation to their other abilities, their intelligence? Yet, we don't want to rely too much on that. We don't want to only look for dyslexia when there's that big gap between their reading ability and their intelligence level, because then we often miss an opportunity to see someone's dyslexia. Sometimes, like I said, the student's oral reading is high enough that it doesn't look like there's this huge gap between their potential and how they're reading, and then they don't get the attention and the intervention they need, but the weakness might show up just in their writing. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I'm sure you can imagine that there's going to be lots of problems with reading comprehension. If it takes so much effort to read the text, or if the text is full of errors, then it's going to be very difficult to understand that. So not only will that happen in your reading work and your language arts work, but then we'll see it affect across all the content areas. Students having problems, difficulty solving word problems, students having issue in social studies, history, science class, because they can't access the content because they have to read to do that, and reading takes so much work or is so full of errors. Likewise, students with dyslexia are less likely to read for pleasure. They are not reading the same kind of books that their peers are reading in class. If they're in a lower reading group, maybe they're just reading decodable text, which is great to teach them to decode, but they're missing out on the opportunity to read books full of rich language and vocabulary and deep concepts and interesting connections across the content areas. They're missing out on all those opportunities that their peers are having. So their vocabulary doesn't grow at the same rate. Their background knowledge doesn't grow at the same rate. You don't like doing what's hard for you. And even sometimes the teachers can be blamed because we, as we're working on their decoding skills, hold them back from developing their vocab and comprehension because of the books we expose them to. So if you can imagine the amount of books a child reads or the amount of minutes they spend reading in contrast with their peers, you can see the difference in how many words they're exposed to each year. And so there you have it right there, that this idea that we want kids to read 20 minutes a day, so we send home the book log and the reading log or whatever, which often ends up just being this tedious, busy work assignment for families, right? But the idea, the purpose behind that crazy assignment is that we want students, if you chip away at it day by day, you're exposed to so many more words per year than if you didn't read. So if you're in a classroom or a school that sends home reading logs, I mean, obviously we want to encourage reading at home. We know we need that extra time spent in books, but remind families that this can be in a variety of formats. This can be a child listening to an audiobook, ideally having the book in front of them, a paper book or a screen, you know, a Kindle or whatever, but listening allows them to hear those concepts, those vocab words, those complex plot lines. That counts. That's good. That counts. Listening to a parent read, going back and forth with a parent, all of that counts. We don't want to sacrifice a student's comprehension and vocabulary skills just so that we can drill them every night at home. If we know we're doing really specialized good reading instruction, then maybe release them at home to do pleasure reading and something that feels good, which might be being read to or listening to audiobooks. This goofy slide is just a reminder of the many very successful people who have contributed to culture, sports, politics, the arts, everything in our country and in our world that we find so important, and these people have or had dyslexia. So right in the center, the woman in the red dress with the bun, that's Patricia Polacco, and you are going to read, there's a YouTube story reading later on in the course of her telling her story of herself struggling with dyslexia as a child, and what's amazing is that she grew up to be an author and illustrator. So I find that pretty amazing to show students that you can be someone who struggles so much with reading and writing, yet you might have such a strength with storytelling or words, which seems like, how could that be? Or maybe that's not where your strengths are, but regardless, it just her story is so personal and poignant that that it always lands well when I share it with my students. All right, all done.